Here is the conference table at which the three delegations met and made decisions, rather, of great importance affecting Europe as well as Asia. Decisions which are affecting us even today.
The Yalta Conference was a monumental event. It occurred towards the end of World War II and is considered to be the high point of Allied cooperation. During the conference, which involved all members of the Big Three, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Marshal Joseph Stalin, and President Franklin Roosevelt, territories were divided, spheres of influence were assigned, and difficult decisions ended in less than satisfactory compromises. Soviet accomplishments in the war up to 1944 alerted Roosevelt to the need of a conference involving all members of the Big Three. He knew that if agreements were not reached before the end of the war, the military and geographic status of the Soviet Union would determine most of the post-war political developments. This situation, though, also meant that Roosevelt and Churchill were in a poor bargaining position. After much discussion, an agreement was reached to hold the meeting from February 4th through 11th in the Russian Crimea. The second official day of the conference was when the participants began to address non-military matters. The main discussion was focused on Germany's treatment in terms of divisions, reparations, and terms of surrender. Churchill, understanding that American presence in Europe would soon come to an end, pushed for France to be more involved in the plans. By building France up as an artificial power, England would not be left to face the Soviet Union alone. Stalin agreed that France should be given its own occupying zone to be carved out of the American and British sections. After the decision was made to give Eastern Germany to the Soviets, changes began almost immediately. Land was taken from former Nazis and redistributed to party members, small peasants, and landless laborers. All people were expected to contribute equally to the workforce, so women quickly became more financially independent than their Western counterparts. While the economy initially suffered from high dependence on trade and fuel imports, it eventually became the 12th most important trading nation in the world and gained the highest per capita income in the Eastern Bloc. These extreme changes were made possible by Allied requirement for an unconditional surrender. With these terms, Germany could have been made to pay harsh reparations. But the failed 1919 Treaty of Versailles still fresh in memory, the Allies forbid monetary reparations. Instead, the German debt would be paid in labor, territory, and industrial assets. It had long been Roosevelt's dream to create a world peace organization, a dream that he manifested in the United Nations. Roosevelt understood that, without the support of the USSR, such an organization would be unable to operate, so he pushed for Russia's involvement. Stalin agreed to participate on the terms that the Soviet Union had 3 votes in the General Assembly. Russia was granted, along with the other permanent members, a veto power against any issue that affected them or their interests directly. It was agreed that the first official meeting of the United Nations would be held in San Francisco. The UN prides itself on having been involved in almost every major war and international crisis since its creation. One aspect that helps to differentiate them from their forerunner, the League of Nations, is a heavy focus on human rights. The United Nations were responsible for setting up war crime tribunals after the Bosnian War and the Rwanda genocide. They also succeeded in getting a Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the General Assembly in 1948.
All those representatives were able to sign on to those principles as universals, and then afterward, practically every constitution in the world that has a Bill of Rights is modeled or influenced in some way by that core of principles that were deemed to be fundamental.
Affiliated groups such as the World Health Organization are responsible for battling against AIDS, tuberculosis, and malaria. Immunizations have also been provided to needy children through UNICEF, which helps to save almost 3 million children each year. On the 6th of February, at the third plenary session, the Polish question was brought up. All members of the Big Three were somehow invested in the outcome of this subject. Stalin was looking to protect his borders, England had entered the war on Poland's behalf, and Roosevelt had the Polish Americans to answer to. In the end, a vaguely worded decision was made to establish a Polish provisional government which would be required to hold democratic elections. The president held that it was the best that could be done for Poland, and the compromise was approved. Joseph Stalin took control of Poland in 1945 and did not allow for elections until 1947, when they were rigged to confirm communist control. Due to the system's ability to resolve unemployment and satisfy basic needs, popular opinion was initially high. But under the puppet government figureheaded by Władysław Gomulka and backed by the Soviet Union, the Polish government experienced a near collapse.
My grandma and grandpa, they think was beautiful idea because they not understand the difference. But my parents, my father, not like communism.
The government debt was around $20 billion in 1980 when they increased food prices by an extensive margin. This sparked even more labor riots and widespread chaos that had become characteristic of the communist regime. Professor Leszek Balcerowicz blamed the economic issues on, quote, the troubles of communism, huge waste, inefficiency, declining production. One of the most pressing issues to the United States and the United Kingdom was that of Russian involvement in the war against Japan. It seemed necessary to have a guarantee of Soviet support. The Far Eastern Agreement was the result of this necessity. Despite not entering the war until after the atomic bomb had been dropped, and thus the conflict essentially won, the Soviet Union received all benefits associated with the Far Eastern Agreement. Russia gained almost complete control over the Manchurian railways and used this power to, in the words of Herbert Hoover, not only deny the Chinese nationalist forces access to Manchuria, but also to supply the Chinese Communist Party with surrendered Japanese arms and goods. The USA made no move to stop this communist expansion despite the waning power of their Asian ally. The USSR also gained a sphere of influence in Korea after President Roosevelt proposed dividing the country in half along the 38th parallel. The joint trusteeship was formed between China, the Soviet Union, and the United States, with the northern half granted to the Russians and Chinese. These supposedly temporary zones of occupation evolved into different Korean regimes based off of the principles of their occupying force. The Soviets appointed Kim Il-sung to head the northern regime. This new leader preached self-reliance and cut down on imports. Due to a lack of oil reserves and other natural resources, the northern economy has floundered in comparison to the thriving southern sector.
We know that there are food shortages in North Korea due to drought, due to crop failures. There's the inherent problems with the heavy restrictions on imports there. And this is actually having an effect to the extent that a malnutrition issue, as a result of the politics of the country, is actually leading to intelligence deficiencies and physical malnutrition.
In comparison, the Republic of Korea's per capita income has grown rapidly to more than 10,000 American dollars from less than $100 annually before the division. Up through 2010, they held ownership of the world's largest steel production site, a foundation for Korea's heavy industry. Economic progress, development, and relative stability have become attributes associated with the regime. The initial response to the Crimean Conference was optimistic to the point of being celebratory. To Americans, it seemed as if cooperation would continue through the post-war period. However, after the death of Roosevelt, an ill-prepared Harry Truman took over office and quickly clashed with the Soviets. Public opinion rapidly turned against Roosevelt and blamed him for handing over Europe and Asia to Stalin and the Communists. McCarthyism took hold of the American public, and the involved governments began to stockpile nuclear weapons. Tensions were at an all-time high as countries on either side of the Iron Curtain were pitted against each other.
Once again, when powerful governments negotiated, the freedom of small nations was somehow expendable. Yet this attempt to sacrifice freedom for the sake of stability left a continent divided and unstable.
Even those who continued to stand behind the former president blamed Yalta for the Cold War.
Any interpretation of Yalta that suggests that the United States agreed to division of spheres of influence is absolutely wrong. The Soviet Union, broke its agreement.
The Crimean Conference is a prime example of powerful nations acting in their own self-interest. The agreements made at Yalta rearranged the map of Europe and Asia by dividing it into spheres of influence without thought to the ambitions of these nations or the consequences of their actions. Some decisions, such as the agreements over Poland and Germany, had sudden but comparatively short consequences, while others, such as the division of Korea along the 38th parallel and the creation of the United Nations, have had long-lasting effects,